In the world of professional wrestling, we're used to seeing superstars step through the curtain under bright lights, playing heroes and villains exactly as the script demands. But once the curtain falls, some of them aren't just evil on TV, they carry a much darker side into real life. From sex scandals, violence and fraud, to crimes so shocking they outrage the entire public, these wrestlers went far beyond the limits of a typical on-screen villain. Today, we're diving into the darkest stories behind the ring, where the mask comes off and their true nature is exposed. Let's get started right now. Wrestling Sphere, go! 1. Hoyt Richard Dick Murdoch. Dick Murdoch, born in 1946, was a second-generation American professional wrestler and the son of Frankie Hill Murdoch. He grew up inside the wrestling business and trained alongside the Funk Brothers. In 1965, Murdoch made his debut, first working as a tag partner with Don Carson before teaming with the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, to form the Texas Outlaws, a pair of brawling, rule-breaking cowboys who quickly drew a lot of attention. After the Texas Outlaws split, Murdoch kept working across various territories in the United States and later went to Japan. He faced Giant Baba, the founder of All Japan Pro Wrestling, and even challenged Harley Race for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. On paper, it was a career with plenty of big moments. But behind the curtain, he was a very different man. In the locker room, Murdoch was infamous for openly racist views, especially targeting black wrestlers. Rocky Johnson, the father of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, recalled that during one match, Murdoch deliberately kicked him as hard as he could simply because of his skin color. Johnson warned him in the ring that if it continued, he would handle it himself. Murdoch ignored him, and Johnson knocked him out cold, forcing the match to be stopped. Stories tying Murdoch to the Ku Klux Klan made his image even darker. On one occasion, Murdoch invited Dusty Rhodes on a drive without saying where they were going. When they stopped, Rhodes realized they were in the middle of a KKK meeting and immediately demanded to leave. Several co-workers have said Murdoch didn't just share their beliefs, he actually carried a Klan membership card. In 2018, Tony Atlas told a story about how he and Tommy Rich were sent to a party in a park and told they would be the life of the party. When they arrived, Rich suddenly pulled Atlas down. As Atlas looked up, he saw a KKK member with a shotgun patrolling just a few steps away. They later learned Murdoch had deliberately sent them there as a cruel joke, fully aware they could be killed. When Atlas asked, "Why would you do that to me?" Murdoch just laughed and said it was just a rib. For Atlas, Murdoch's Klan membership was no rumor. Murdoch had admitted it to his face. Murdoch died of a heart attack in 1996 at the age of 49, and since then his name has all but vanished from WWE history. 2. Jimmy Superfly Snuka. Jimmy Superfly Snuka was once one of the first true high-flying stars in American wrestling, blowing crowds away with his Superfly splash from the top rope. On television, he was a soaring icon. In real life, though, Snuka's name is forever tied to a suspicious death that has never been fully explained. In May 1983, after a TV taping, Snuka and his girlfriend, Nancy Argentino, stayed at a roadside motel in Allentown, Pennsylvania. That night, paramedics were called and found Nancy unconscious, her body covered in bruises. She was rushed to the hospital but was quickly pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed injuries consistent with being beaten, but the final report listed the cause of death as undetermined. Snuka told police, and later Vince McMahon, that Nancy had slipped on the motel's outside walkway and hit her head. Nancy's family never believed that story, and anyone who followed the case saw huge contradictions in his explanations. Not long after, her family filed a wrongful death civil suit and won, with a judgment of $500,000 in damages. Snuka never paid that amount, and the criminal side of the case faded away, partly because prosecutors at the time claimed they didn't have enough evidence to charge him. In 2013, a series of investigative articles in a local newspaper brought the case back into the spotlight, highlighting inconsistencies in Snuka's statements and questioning why he had never been prosecuted. Public pressure eventually led to a grand jury indicting Snuka in 2015 on charges of third-degree murder and manslaughter. By then, his health had collapsed. He was battling stomach cancer and showing signs of severe cognitive decline. In January 2017, a judge ruled that Snuka was not mentally competent to stand trial and dismissed the case. 2 weeks later, Jimmy Superfly Snuka passed away. For the Argentino family, that decision never felt like closure. In their eyes, Snuka's fame and the influence of the wrestling company helped shield him from full accountability. And for many fans, the simple fact that a grand jury once believed there was enough evidence to charge him has permanently stained the legacy of a man who was once celebrated as a legend in the ring. 3. New Jack. If you ever watched ECW in the 1990s, you probably remember New Jack as the wildest man in a locker room where almost nobody seemed normal to begin with. As part of a gangsta-style tag team, he took pride in pushing violence to the extreme. With New Jack, there was almost no line between his on-screen persona and the real person, and the stories that follow prove it wasn't just an act. The most notorious incident happened in 1996 at a small show in Massachusetts. Eric Koulis, a 17-year-old kid with no real training, lied about his age and experience to convince Paul Heyman to let him work a tag match. Backstage, Koulis even asked New Jack to blade him so there would be real blood during the bout. But once the bell rang, things went far beyond what he imagined. Instead of a small cut, New Jack used a surgical scalpel and sliced so deep that blood sprayed from Koulis's forehead. He kept attacking while taunting the crowd, even screaming that he hoped the kid would bleed to death. Koulis's father stood at ringside, panicking and begging for help, while his son ended up needing more than 50 stitches. Police arrested New Jack and charged him with assault with a dangerous weapon. In court, he claimed Koulis had agreed to everything, and the jury ultimately acquitted him. Still, most veterans in the business condemned what happened, saying no professional would ever cut an inexperienced teenager that badly. The violence didn't stop there. In 2004, during a match in Florida with William Hunter Lane, New Jack pulled a knife from his pocket and stabbed Lane multiple times. At first, fans thought it was part of the show, until they saw a pool of blood spreading under Lane's body. In a later documentary, New Jack bragged that he had actually wanted to kill his opponent and only stopped because he knew the police were on their way. Authorities called it one of the most brutal assaults they had ever dealt with. New Jack spent 3 weeks in jail before Lane chose not to pursue the case, saying the entire situation stemmed from an angle they had agreed on. From that point on, to some hardcore fans, New Jack remained a crazy legend. But to many others, he was nothing more than a reckless, irresponsible man who was willing to gamble with his co-workers' safety just to create a few shocking moments in the ring. 4. Juana Barraza. From a young age, Juana's life was already a chain of tragedies. She never went to school, was illiterate, and had almost no real bond with her mother. Instead of protecting her, her mother was the one who pushed Juana straight into hell. At just 12 years old, she was traded to a man named Jose Lugo in exchange for 3 bottles of beer. From that moment on, Juana's childhood was tied to violence and abuse. After her mother died of cirrhosis, Juana moved to Mexico City hoping for a fresh start. What she found instead were broken marriages and the burden of raising 4 children on her own. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, she scraped by with odd jobs while touring central Mexico as a masked wrestler under the name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. The name reflected who she was, quiet, withdrawn, but full of pent-up resentment inside. By 1995, after giving birth to her 4th child and watching her finances crumble, Juana began shoplifting and quickly escalated to breaking into people's homes. In 1996, she teamed up with Araceli Tapia Martinez and came up with a plan to steal from the elderly. The two would dress in white, impersonate nurses to gain access to seniors living alone, then help themselves to valuables once inside. In 2000, Juana retired from wrestling, where each match only earned her about 300 to 500 pesos, and her situation became even more desperate. Around the same time, Mexico City was shaken by a wave of brutal murders targeting elderly people. The press began talking about a serial killer nicknamed El Mata Viejitas, the little old lady killer. At first, Juana wasn't on the police radar, but it didn't take long before she herself was adding more elderly victims to that bloody list. Depending on each victim's condition and circumstances, Juana would find a way to earn their trust, offering massages, helping with medication, or simply showing interest and kindness until she was invited inside. Once they let their guard down, she struck. Strangulation was her usual method. If anyone resisted, she would beat them first, using the holds and strikes she'd learned in the ring. In 2008, Juana went to trial on charges connected to 30 murders. The court found her guilty of 16 killings and 12 robberies, handing down a total sentence of 759 years in prison. Even so, at least on paper, she could still be eligible for conditional release in 2058, when she would be around 100 years old, if she lives that long. 5. Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit is a name that makes the entire wrestling world shudder whenever it's mentioned. The Rabid Wolverine was once beloved for his incredible technical skill, insane in-ring intensity, and more than 20 years grinding his way from New Japan and ECW to WWE. The peak of his career came at WrestleMania XX, when he hoisted the World Heavyweight Championship under a shower of confetti. But behind the glory, disturbing warning signs had quietly begun to surface. Friends noticed Benoit becoming quick-tempered, emotionally unstable, and obsessively fixated on extreme weight training. In June 2007, a man who almost never missed a show suddenly no-showed several WWE events. On June 25, police arrived at his home in Fayetteville, Georgia, and discovered a horrifying scene. His wife Nancy, known to fans as Woman, and their 7-year-old son Daniel were both dead in separate rooms, each body lying next to a Bible. Investigators concluded that Benoit had bound Nancy's wrists and ankles, then strangled her with a cord. On the final day, Benoit adjusted a weight machine to hang himself. There was no suicide note, only another Bible placed on the floor. Prosecutor Scott Ballard described it as a crime so shocking that even veteran investigators were shaken. The timeline suggested everything unfolded over 3 days, during which Benoit was still texting coworkers, giving excuses for his absence. Toxicology reports found an abnormally high level of testosterone in his system, along with hydrocodone and Xanax. Some argued that long-term steroid use and repeated concussions had caused severe brain damage. Benoit's father later agreed to have his son's brain examined, and the results showed advanced CTE. Others pointed to legal documents. In 2003, Nancy had filed for divorce, accusing him of cruel treatment, although the two eventually reconciled. Whatever the ultimate cause, the fallout was devastating. WWE scrapped a planned tribute show and all but erased Benoit from its products. Sponsors pressured the company to tighten drug testing and overhaul its wellness policies. Fans were left to face a brutal reality. The man they had once cheered as a hero was the same person who murdered his own family. Since then, WWE has almost never spoken Chris Benoit's name again. 6. Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody was the definition of a wild beast, towering frame, wild hair and beard, a chaotic brawling style, and a rebellious attitude. He was a top star in Japan and Puerto Rico, fiercely guarding his independence. He controlled his own schedule, negotiated his own pay, and wasn't afraid to refuse to do the job if he felt it would hurt his status. Many people later believed that this stubborn refusal to bow to anyone played a part in the mysterious way he died. On July 16, 1988, before a show in San Juan, Brody was in the locker room when Jose Gonzalez, a local legend wrestling as Invader 1, walked over and asked to speak with him in a corner. Moments later, other wrestlers heard an argument, then saw Brody staggering out, clutching his stomach, blood pouring everywhere. Tony Atlas later recalled carrying Brody onto a stretcher while people screamed for medical staff. The ambulance took more than half an hour to push through the packed stadium crowd. At the hospital, doctors removed about 40 centimeters of Brody's intestines, but they still couldn't save his life. Gonzalez later turned himself in and claimed he had acted in self-defense, saying Brody had threatened him with a knife first. No one else could confirm that story. When the case went to trial, key witnesses like Tony Atlas never received their subpoenas in time. By the time they found out, the proceedings were already over. With no live testimony from those who were actually there, the jury acquitted Gonzalez. Within the business, many wrestlers believed the trial had been handled, and that the tight-knit wrestling scene in Puerto Rico had closed ranks to protect him. Gonzalez went on to continue wrestling and promoting shows, but he rarely left the island again. Barbara, Brody's widow, said she felt utterly betrayed by the justice system. His death didn't just take away a husband and father, it sent a chilling message. Wrestlers could harm or even kill one another and still walk free if the local promoter had enough pull. Bruiser Brody's legacy lives on in the roar of crowds chanting his name and the raised arms of fans honoring him. But the way he died remains one of the darkest, most dubious stains in the entire history of professional wrestling. 7. Buck Rock and Roll Zumho. Buck Zumho used to be a familiar face in AWA and various regional territories in the 1980s. His gimmick was that of a rock and roll goofball cosplaying Elvis, sunglasses on, roller skating around the ring, looking like some over-the-top sideshow act at a traveling carnival. To many fans, he was just a harmless clown, there to fill time and get a few laughs between the real matches. But behind that flashy, goofy facade was someone hiding some of the darkest and most disgusting secrets imaginable. In 2013, Zumho's biological daughter, now an adult, finally broke her silence. She told investigators that her own father had been abusing her since she was just 15, and that the nightmare went on for years. According to court records, Zumho repeatedly manipulated and threatened her, weaponizing their emotional bond and family relationship to keep her quiet. The true cruelty was how he turned the place that should have been safest, home, into a psychological prison for his own child. Worse yet, this wasn't his first run-in with the law. Previously, Zumho had been convicted for indecent exposure in 1989 and again in 1999, but those sentences still didn't stop him from spiraling even further. When the abuse of his daughter finally came to light, the jury found him guilty on 2 counts of first-degree criminal sexual conduct and 2 counts of third-degree criminal sexual conduct. As the verdict was read, Zumho suddenly bolted from his seat, trying to run out of the courtroom, but was quickly tackled and restrained by officers. The image of the once-rock and roll act, now slumped over, sobbing, in handcuffs and leg irons, being led away, burned itself into the minds of everyone present. The judge sentenced him to more than 25 years in prison, with a minimum of 17 years to be served before he could even be considered for parole, and an additional decade of supervision if he ever walks free. For those who used to see Zumho as just a goofy comic act in the ring, the truth landed like an ice-cold slap. It exposed the horrifying darkness that can lurk behind wrestling's carnival atmosphere, where all the noise and spectacle can hide monsters wearing human faces. 8. Dynamite Kid. Tom "Dynamite Kid" Billington was born in 1958 in Lancashire, England, into a family steeped in violence and fists. His father, uncle, and grandfather were all boxers, and if you go further back in the family line, there was even an executioner. Instead of following them into boxing, he chose professional wrestling, debuting in 1976. He quickly drew attention with his explosive style, eventually catching the eye of Stu Hart, who invited him to Canada to work for Stampede Wrestling. In Calgary, while sharpening his in-ring skills, Billington also fell into steroids and other performance enhancers. His muscles grew, but so did his volatility and aggression. After about a year, he moved on to Japan to chase bigger opportunities. There, Billington teamed up with his cousin Davey Boy Smith to form the British Bulldogs. In the ring, they were hot commodities. Backstage, Dynamite Kid built a reputation as a bully. He liked to pull ribs that weren't harmless pranks, but outright cruelty meant to humiliate other wrestlers. The most infamous victim was Mitch Snow, a young wrestler Billington thought was too mouthy. He spiked Snow's drink with sleeping pills, waited until he passed out, then defecated in his gear bag and shaved off his eyebrows, turning him into a locker room joke. There were also stories that he once injected steroids into a dog, a detail chilling enough to make anyone recoil. The aggression escalated when Billington brutally attacked Jacques Rougeau backstage. Not long after, Rougeau got his revenge, smashing him in the face with a punch loaded with a roll of quarters, knocking out 4 of Billington's teeth and leaving his face swollen. For WWF, that was the final straw, and in 1988 they cut ties with Dynamite Kid. Shoved out of the big-time spotlight, Billington went back to Japan in a body wrecked by injuries, especially to his back. The constant pain made him even more vicious, and this time, his fury turned on his own family. The abuse pushed Michelle to the point where she once considered ending both her life and the children's just to escape. In 1991, she bought Dynamite a one-way ticket back to England and told him bluntly she wanted him out of their lives. Dynamite Kid's final match took place in 1996, when his body was only a shadow of what it once was, most of his muscle mass gone from steroid damage, and confined to a wheelchair due to paralysis in his left leg. He died on December 5, 2018, on his 60th birthday. Michelle believes steroids helped turn him into a violent abuser, but whatever the cause, nothing erases what he did to his family, and that broken, lonely end feels like a final sentence on the life he chose to live. 9. Scott Hall. In the early 1980s, before the world knew him as Razor Ramon with a leather vest and toothpick hanging from his lips, Scott Hall was just another young wrestler struggling to make it. By day, he was on the road chasing bookings. By night, he took whatever odd jobs he could find to pay the bills, including working as a bouncer at a strip club in Orlando, Florida. One night in October 1983, a seemingly routine shift turned into a nightmare that would haunt him forever. In the club's parking lot, Hall got into an altercation with a man named Rodney Perry Turner. Different accounts and reports from afterward don't line up perfectly on every detail, but according to Hall, Turner smashed the window of his car with a metal object. In a state of panic and fear, Hall ran to his car and grabbed a handgun. During a struggle at extremely close range, the gun went off. The bullet struck Turner, who died shortly afterward. Hall was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. However, investigators couldn't gather enough clear, decisive evidence to secure a conviction. The charges were eventually dropped, and he never went to trial. The case faded from public view, but for Scott Hall himself, it never truly ended. Years later, in an interview with ESPN, he admitted he was tormented by recurring nightmares and believed he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Hall said he never got over that night and carried the weight of guilt and regret for the rest of his life. The incident was rarely mentioned during Scott Hall's career, partly because he was never convicted of a crime. But the reality is this: the man who would later be inducted into the Hall of Fame once shot and killed another person without ever having to stand before a jury. When we talk about evil or wrongdoing, things aren't always black and white. Scott Hall insisted he acted in self-defense, and the legal system accepted that. For Rodney Turner's family, though, the story almost certainly isn't that simple. 10. Verne Gagne. There are cases where the idea of evil suddenly becomes blurry, especially when old age and illness get involved. Verne Gagne is one of those examples. He wasn't just a legendary wrestler, but also the powerful figure behind the AWA, the man who helped shape the careers of stars like Ric Flair and the Iron Sheik. Throughout his career, Gagne was remembered as a strict but calm mentor, someone who carried himself more like a father figure backstage than a violent man outside the ring. But by 2009, things were very different. Gagne was an 82-year-old man, frail, with his memory shattered by Alzheimer's, living in a special care facility in Minnesota. On January 26th of that year, inside the care center, Gagne had an altercation with another resident, 97-year-old Helmut Gutmann, a Holocaust survivor. According to witnesses, Gagne lifted Gutmann up and slammed him onto the floor. The fall broke Gutmann's hip, a catastrophic injury at that age. He never recovered and died 3 weeks later. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, and police opened an investigation. Even so, legal experts agreed that it would be nearly impossible to prosecute Verne Gagne. Alzheimer's had left him incapable of fully understanding his actions or forming criminal intent. His son, Greg Gagne, could only call it a tragedy for both sides, something heartbreaking and utterly helpless. For fans, the idea that a respected icon in wrestling history was the person who unintentionally caused another elderly man's death was extremely hard to accept. Many argued that the real culprit was dementia, not malice. But that doesn't erase the grief of the Gutmann family. The incident stands as a brutal reminder. Idols grow old, minds deteriorate, and sometimes in a confused moment, they hurt others without even realizing it. Is that still evil? For those who have to live with the consequences, the answer may very well be yes. 11. Alberto Del Rio. Among the most controversial modern names, Alberto Del Rio is a textbook example of how accusations alone can drag an entire career into the abyss. On screen, he played an arrogant Mexican aristocrat, rolling up in luxury cars with scarves, suits, and a smug grin. In real life, Del Rio was true wrestling royalty, born into a famous lucha family, a multi-time world champion, and even a former MMA representative for Mexico. But by 2020, that image was buried under a wave of serious allegations. On May 9, 2020, San Antonio police arrested Del Rio after his ex-girlfriend accused him of tying her hands with boxing hand wraps, stuffing a sock in her mouth, and sexually assaulting her for hours at his home. She also claimed he threatened to take her son away if she dared go to the police. A grand jury later indicted Del Rio on 1 count of aggravated kidnapping and 4 counts of sexual assault. If convicted, he could have faced up to 99 years in prison. Del Rio was released on bond and publicly denied everything, insisting he was innocent. In December 2021, the case was dismissed when the woman did not appear in court, closing the file without any final verdict. Mexican media reported that prosecutors had to drop the charges because the alleged victim refused to cooperate. Del Rio, meanwhile, claimed he had been the target of an extortion attempt. Wherever the truth lies, the fallout is undeniable. He lost bookings, his reputation, already damaged by previous domestic violence allegations involving his former fiancée Paige, was further stained. In the age of social media, sometimes simply being linked to accusations of horrific crimes is enough to destroy a public image, almost as effectively as an actual conviction. Fans are left with an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Should they believe the man they once saw on TV, or the woman whose story was never fully tested in a courtroom? 12. Hardbody Harrison. Hardbody Harrison was born in 1966 in Kennesaw, Georgia, and grew up like many ordinary American kids. He went to high school in Pensacola, Florida, and after graduating in 1985, he joined the United States Army. After receiving an honorable discharge in 1995, Harrison headed to Atlanta, Georgia, to chase his dream of becoming a professional wrestler at WCW's training center. During 4 years with WCW, his career never really took off. Harrison didn't win a single televised match. The only things that stood out were his odd ring gear and a ring name that sounded a lot bigger than his actual status. His last WCW match took place in 1999, but on paper he remained under contract until 2001, when the company was bought by Vince McMahon. WWE chose not to sign him, and Harrison quietly retired not long after. You'd think the story would end as a tale of an underwhelming career, but what happened after wrestling was far more disturbing. Harrison joined a class action lawsuit led by Sonny Ono, representing several WCW wrestlers who sued AOL Time Warner for racial discrimination. The case was settled out of court, and everyone involved, including Harrison, received a significant payout. According to Disco Inferno, when Harrison went to pick up his money, he arrived with 8 women. They barely spoke to anyone, their faces tense, eyes distant, as if they were somewhere they had no control over. Later that year, Harrison was arrested after reports surfaced that he had been keeping 8 women in his home. He was charged with serious sexual offenses, forced labor, conspiracy, and witness tampering. Acting as his own attorney, Harrison insisted that the women were living with him and his wife because they wanted to be trained as professional wrestlers, and that he was helping them get clean from addiction. The witnesses told a completely different story. They said Harrison had psychologically manipulated them, cut them off from their families, and made them dependent on him. Harrison's in-ring career went nowhere, but what followed was dark enough to make the name Hardbody Harrison stand out as one of the most disturbing figures ever mentioned in the world of professional wrestling. 13. Nick Gage. In the world of independent wrestling, if you had to pick one name that defines pure ultraviolence, it would be Nick Gage. His battleground isn't just made of steel chairs and wooden tables, but light tubes, shattered glass, and even pizza cutters, turning each match into something that looks like a public torture session. But while Gage's in-ring persona kept getting more insane, his real life was sliding completely off the rails. A string of injuries and a wrecked body led him to rely on painkillers, then spiral into hard drugs. He's admitted that he burned through almost everything he earned on substances, at one point sleeping in his car because he didn't even have a proper place to live. On December 22, 2010, broke and mentally fried, Gage threw on a hoodie, walked into a PNC bank branch in Collingswood, New Jersey, slipped a note demanding cash to the teller, and walked out with $3,090 in hand. The bank's security cameras clearly captured his tattoos, and it didn't take long for fans to recognize the robber as Nick Gage. Knowing there was no way to talk his way out of it, he turned himself in on New Year's Eve. In March 2011, Gage pled guilty to second-degree robbery as part of a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with a requirement to serve at least 85% of that time. He was also ordered to pay restitution to the bank and the terrified teller. In interviews from behind bars, Gage said he'd been so high on OxyContin that he didn't care whether he lived or died. He ended up serving about 4 years and was released in 2015, returning to wrestling and gaining near-cult status as a sort of outlaw anti-hero, with crowds roaring MDK, murder death kill, every time he walked out. Gage has been brutally honest about his mistakes and insists prison saved his life, serving as a harsh reminder of how addiction and a career built on constant physical punishment can push someone right to the edge of criminal destruction. 14. Jimmy Savile. If you don't live in the UK, the name Jimmy Savile might not ring many bells. But for people in Britain, it stands as a symbol of one of the darkest, most shameful chapters in modern pop culture. Savile was once a famous DJ and TV personality, celebrated as a kind of national hero for his high-profile charity work. For decades, his public image was all smiles, family-friendly shows, and endless praise. Almost no one imagined that behind that polished facade lurked a completely different person. Savile had close ties to Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where he was given the role of Golden Fundraiser, and was allowed to move almost freely through its corridors. He came and went like he owned the place, especially in the children's ward. Things got so bad that some nurses quietly warned kids, "If he comes in, just pretend you're asleep." Those whispered warnings, tragically, went ignored for many years. Only after Savile died in 2011 did the full truth explode into the open. Hundreds of women came forward, accusing him of sexually abusing them when they were still minors. Many of their stories dated back to the 1960s, centered around Stoke Mandeville, Leeds General Infirmary, Duncroft School, and the TV studios of Top of the Pops and Jim'll Fix It, places once seen as magical childhood spaces on television. Several victims said they had gone to the police long ago, but their reports vanished into a void. With his reputation as a saint of charity, Savile was always believed over the children. On top of that, he had powerful friends in important positions, enough to bury scandal after scandal before they had a chance to surface. What few people realize is that, aside from his media career, Savile actually dabbled in professional wrestling in the 1960s. Those appearances were so forgettable that almost no one even remembers them. In the end, history doesn't remember him as a wrestler at all, but as an indelible stain, a monster in plain sight burned into the memory of an entire generation. 15. Devin Nicholson. In the independent wrestling scene, the name Devin Nicholson, better known as Hannibal, is tied to ultra-violent matches and plenty of controversy. He drew attention when he publicly blasted WWE for pulling his contract after he tested positive for hepatitis C. The story didn't end there. A court later found that Nicholson had contracted the virus from Abdullah the Butcher, and he won a negligence lawsuit, being awarded $2.3 million, a case that shook the wrestling world. In December 2021, Nicholson was booked in Texas for WCPW's Christmas Star Wars show, promoted as a nostalgic event featuring Mick Foley and members of the Von Erich family. On paper, it was supposed to be a fun throwback night for fans. But after losing his match, everything suddenly took a very different turn. In a post-match angle, Nicholson turned on referee Lando Del Toro, attacking him with what appeared to be a sharp metal spike, repeatedly driving it into his head even as Del Toro tried to crawl away. Del Toro later said he had only agreed to a small blade cut for effect, but what actually happened went far beyond anything discussed. He lost around 3 pints of blood, went into shock, and needed emergency surgery to repair a severed artery. Photos of his scalp stapled shut in the hospital bed left fans horrified and furious. Promoter Jerry Bostic immediately announced that Nicholson was banned from his promotion and issued a public apology to the audience. Nicholson responded with a video calling the situation a misunderstanding, insisting he thought Del Toro was just selling the attack as planned. The referee completely rejected that claim, saying there was no way to protect himself with a nearly 300-pound man driving a knee into his back and a weapon into his head. Police opened an investigation, but Del Toro ultimately chose not to press charges. Even so, the incident became a chilling warning about safety in independent wrestling and a stark example of what can happen when a wrestler loses sight of the line between scripted violence and real-life assault. These stories aren't here to glorify crime, but to remind us that behind the bright lights, there are always terrifying shadows. If you want to keep exploring the dark side of the wrestling world, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Wrestling Sphere, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future episodes.